coming up from the Northeast Live studios in Guwahati. Northeast Tonight with Wasbir Hussain.
Hello and welcome to Northeast Tonight, the show that decodes the region. It is now clear China is putting specific new laws in place to go about increasing defense along the line of actual control bordering India, besides building infrastructure to accommodate both military personnel and civilians. These are called dual-use villages, and some such facilities have already sprung up along Arunachal Pradesh's upper Subansiri area. India is aware of these dual-use villages and has confirmed having lodged strong protests to Beijing through diplomatic channels. An MEA spokesman said on Thursday that China has been engaged in such constructions for several years in border areas, including in areas it has been illegally occupying for decades. The place where China has built a 100-home village along Arunachal Pradesh is said to be under illegal Chinese occupation since 1959. But the big question is whether Beijing wants to push this as part of its border policy. This question has arisen because China on the 23rd of October passed a land boundary law that authorizes it to push ahead with measures to strengthen the border defense and support initiatives for economic and social development in border areas, besides improving public services and infrastructure and encouraging and supporting people's life and work. Now, the Pentagon too has confirmed the existence of such dual-use villages along the line of actual control on the border with India, raising concerns on our side. But what is of added significance to Assam and the Northeast is the fact that the Chinese law also refers to the principles governing water resources across border rivers. The Chinese law says, and I quote, "China upholds its legitimate rights and interests on the transboundary rivers such as the Yarlung Jangbo and Langkang Mekong River and is willing to collaborate in water resources utilization in these basins, which involve South and Southeast Asian countries." Can this mean that China is considering the trans-border rivers that originate within its territory as internal waters, which it can divert wherever it wants? We are asking this question because there are credible reports that China is indeed pushing plans to divert the Yarlung Tsangpo or the Brahmaputra. To discuss the issue and more, I am joined from New Delhi by Professor Swaran Singh from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, by far one of India's best-known experts on China. Joining me also from New Delhi is Professor Srikant Kandapalli, another highly respected expert on China affairs. From Arunachal Pradesh, I am joined by Mr. Mutsu Mithi, President of the NPP in Arunachal Pradesh. From Pasighat, also in Arunachal Pradesh, I am joined by Congress MLA and former MP Mr. Ninong Ering, someone who has been extremely vocal on issues concerning India and China. Gentlemen, welcome to Northeast Tonight. Let me go to you first, Professor Swaran Singh. What's going on? Do you think that China is trying to legitimize its border push? Do you think that China, by passing the land boundary law on the 23rd of October, is preparing the grounds to make it part of the state policy to actually hold on to areas it has been illegally occupying since decades, and at the same time building new infrastructure for the use of both its military and civilians? What do you think?
Thank you, Basweer. There are multiple ways one can look at this land border law being passed on 23rd of October. There has been much greater uproar or demand for protecting maritime boundaries, which remain largely disputed. So last year, for example, China did pass similar laws for the Coast Guard law and, of course, for their maritime traffic security and safety law. But this land border law is very strange because China has 14 land border countries, and it has one temporary agreement with Pakistan, which is almost the most allied ally of Chinese. Then it is Bhutan and India. With Bhutan, you remember last month they signed an MOU to take forward their border talks,
Right.
whereas we have seen much bigger tensions with India. So the law apparently is meant to address their concerns with India, and a lot of very interesting provisions, including the one you mentioned of quote unquote absolute control on what they call internal rivers. And of course, also talking of, there have been arrangements between China and India of no use of firepower. This law talks about how patrolling party officials can use police instructions of detaining people and even using weapons in case violence is used. And of course, third, also disallowing any permanent constructions in what they call in border areas or periphery of border regions. Does it mean even the region which India claims to be our own? And finally, I think also the domestic angle of Xi Jinping, being reinforced as a great leader, equivalent to Mao Zedong, who has had policies in 2014 of really reinforcing and forging national consciousness among China's minorities, which has been a continuing refrain of Xi Jinping. And in this case, by building border regions, saying that border region local governments have to contribute in creating what they're saying as some kind of a border militia, I think it's a very interesting way of multiple ways of looking at what this law means on the
Right.
ground.
Right.
Of course, formally, MOFA says it will have no impact on existing China-India arrangements. So that should bring some relief, but there is something which is mischievous about it.
Absolutely. We'll have to wait and watch whether it impacts India-China relations or not. India firmly thinks that it will not impact on the existing India-China relations, but we'll have to wait and watch. We cannot be under any kind of assumption at this point in time. We'll have to wait and watch. Let me turn to you, Professor Kondapalli. Do you think it is part of the China's internal dynamics? The plenary that ended on the 11th of October, once again reinforcing the strength, reinforcing the power of the supreme leader, that is Xi Jinping, and being the president for life and so on. Do you think that is part of the domestic compulsions that have made China do this kind of a thing, or do you think there is real cause for worry, this land border law?
Well, the sixth plenum decision is different from the land border law. The sixth plenum did not mention that Xi Jinping will be given a life term for the party post or central military commission or other things. It just mentioned about his core leadership position.
Right.
Of course, it did praise Xi Jinping on various counts, but there is no explicit mention in the communique, not the resolution, about the life term for Xi Jinping. So I think we should be clear on that. On the issue that you raised on the land border law, there are 7 chapters and 62 articles in this. And in the process, the Chinese are trying to say that they will consolidate the whole of the area. Number one, the Article 4 of this land border law says that it has China's sovereignty and territorial integrity is very sacred and inviolable. So in terms of a war, they are willing to shut down the whole borders, which is currently what we have in the India-China border areas. Number two, the Article 10 is significant here because they want to strengthen the border defense construction or the economic and social development aspects. Then it also mentions about the cooperation zones at the border, maintaining flood and fire control, and so on. There is Article 15 of this land border law, which mentions about principles of equality and mutual trust. However, when we look at the 13 corps commanders meeting so far, the synchronized disengagement that they talked about on February 10th this year, the defense ministries,
Right.
that did not happen so far because we still have some areas where the disengagement has not happened. Article 22 of this land border law, it mentions about border duties and organizing drills and countering invasion, encroachment, provocation, or other aspects,
Right.
which basically suggests then that they are going to take a proactive or a preemptive military strategy in this sphere.
Okay.
Article 43 is where you have mentioned about those well-off societies. So they're going to take forward the well-off society construction. Out of 628, 200 are going to be on the line of actual control, including in Lungchu, where we saw the Pentagon paper mentioning about it.
Right.
There are so many Medok, Geru, Rima, Marmag, Chayu, Yume township, which is in Ningchi prefecture, Sarichu, Lungchu, Sona Lepo, Chumishang, Chiru village, Yatung, Pangta, bordering Bhutan, or other places in Jakarlung
So,
in
so,
Bhutan.
so I'm coming back to you. So what you were suggesting, Professor Kandapalli, is that this is part of a very calculated design, and there definitely this indicates that they're going to push ahead with border defense and border infrastructure building. I'll come back to you. Let me go to Mr. Ninong Ering. I'm coming to you, Mr. Muchumisi Mithi ji. Mr. Ninongering, how do you look at this? Because as we have been assuming or as we have been interpreting, do you think that China is preparing the ground? Do you think they want to make it a part of their regular border policy to hold on to areas which have been illegally occupied? For example, that particular village which has come up in the Subansiri area, that is also under illegal occupation since 1959. Do you think, how do you look at this land border deal, and what should be India's response?
Namaskar and good evening.
Namaskar.
Really, the China's legislatures which they have adopted on the 23rd, and which they said that they would implement it from the January 1st. Here, of course, I cannot speak on behalf of the government, but as a resident of Arunachal Pradesh, which is going to bear the brunt of it, here I can really appreciate what our experts, Mr. Swaran Singh and Mr. Kandapalli has said. I have also just read in the newspaper that the new land border law was adopted, and it is on the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of China. Now, what China does with itself or what laws are implemented on that, I cannot comment on that. But the People's Republic of China, they have said that it's sacred and inviolable. The state shall take measures to safeguard territorial integrity and land boundaries and guard against and combat any act. Now, here I would like to say that in Arunachal Pradesh, when China is saying that Arunachal is South Tibet, how is the government of India going to place the demand that, okay, where are you going? Where is the Lakshman Rekha? Where is the McMahon line? That has to be pondered upon, because their law is implemented on their side. We have got no objection. Of course, you must be aware, and I think Mr. Swaran Singh had said that in Bhutan and India, they are the only two countries. There are 14 countries which border China. Here, like you are saying, that on the water treaty, we have got no water treaty with China.
Yeah.
But they are saying that on Brahmaputra, the Yarlung Zangfo, here they are saying that this is the source is in China, so we are going to do whatever we want with it. But that is wrong, because
Right.
uh, if you go to
So,
the, yeah,
So, Ninong Eding ji,
yeah,
that means an appropriate Indian response to this is extremely important, because it, on one side they are trying to make it a part of the policy, hold on to the areas they have been illegally occupying, and
yes, yes,
secondly, that land border law talking about the rivers as originating in China as their internal waters can have serious implications in
it
view
will.
of the fact that there is already a credible reports about China trying to divert the Brahmaputra. I'll come back to you,
Yes.
Mr. Ninong Ering. Let me go to Mr. Mutsu Mithi, the president of the National People's Party of Arunachal Pradesh, a highly vocal political leader in the state. Mr. Mutsu Mithi, as a resident, as a proud Indian, and as a resident of Arunachal Pradesh, how do you look at these new developments? Suppose that the Chinese are building villages right on your border,
Am I audible?
making it possible for the Chinese military as well as
Hello?
civilians to occupy dual-use villages. So, what kind of feelings cross your mind?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you, Wasbir. Obviously, the network here is very erratic, so I couldn't hear all your questions. But, there are many experts who are giving their views in this, programs already. So, I would just like to give the reaction of the people of Arunachal Pradesh.
Right.
Uh, these kinds of activities by the PLA and skirmishes keep on happening. It's been going on since decades. While the people of Arunachal Pradesh are very patriotic, and the nationalism is in their culture, in our culture, but there has not been much evoke or reaction from the people of Arunachal Pradesh, because this is a long drawn issue that has been going on since long. The Chumdarangchu Valley, 86, 87, prior to that, 1962, and then, the staple visa issues and multiple things. So the people of Arunachal are sort of immune to it. But having said that, the people of Arunachal are very patriotic, and even during the 1962 and afterwards, it has always assisted the armed forces, Indian armed forces together. They have worked together with it. The local people provides the intelligence and inputs that is required. But having said all that, whatever is the bigger picture of the foreign policy issues, but we do feel in one side of the border, on the other side of the LAC, we see huge infrastructural गतिविधि बहुत बढ़ चुका है.
Ji.
Whereas on our part, on our region, we have to trek for so many miles just to reach the LAC. 7 days, trackings and things like that. So even the administrative units have not been ramped up in terms of infrastructure. So in the larger picture, in the larger, strategic picture,
Right.
I think, the logistic preparedness has really been ramped up in the last 10 to 15 years, but more needs to be done on it.
Absolutely.
And
More
that is
needs
why
to be
the
done.
people
Right. More
Yes.
needs to be done. Nobody can deny that fact. More needs to be done. Yes, there has been improvements in the infrastructure in the last 10 to 15 years, but definitely, as Mr. Mutsumithi has said, more needs to be done. But let me turn to you once again. Mr. Mithi, I'm coming back to you once again, to both the political voices from Arunachal Pradesh. Let me once again go to Professor Swaran Singh. Professor Swaran Singh, what Mutsumithi has said is very significant. He said that people of Arunachal Pradesh have become immune to developments along the border with China. Now, we had the 1962 war, we had the Chinese occupying the Chumdurangchu Valley in 1986-87, then you have the staple visa issue. But don't you think that this people getting immune is a problem? Because I'm not saying we have full faith, because the military today, the Indian Army today is a highly professional army that has also increased its capabilities and quite capable of dealing with the Chinese threats in 2021. That was not the case in 1962. But that aside, the people getting immune to these kind of things, do you think that is a cause for concern?
Basweer, I think slightly different. I think what he's trying to say when he says people in Arunachal Pradesh have become immune, I think he's meaning immune to threats and these kind of wolf warrior posturing that Chinese do. Otherwise, you and all of us are fully aware of enormous cooperation, coordination that people of Arunachal Pradesh have invariably presented
Oh
in
yes,
supporting Indian Army while patrolling parties are going in the frontier areas.
yes.
I think I want to emphasize on two very quick issues which are implications for India. The Article 4 clearly says that in the periphery of the border regions, any permanent construction would require prior authorization by the Chinese government. It's very fuzzy. They are not saying whether it is construction inside to the Chinese side of what they think is Chinese border, or periphery also includes what is outside of what they think is the Chinese border. And if you recall, it is fundamentally infrastructure building, the road construction, which has been at the center of tensions for last 2 years now. And in that sense, it's a clear indication to what they want to tell India on what they're planning to do. Second thing I think that should concern us immediately is this shift. If you notice the August 2021 draft of this law, it was basically talking of seeking local citizens' support in management, defense, demarcation, delineation of the border. But now the final version of the law is talking of creating mass defense groups
Yes.
where local governments are going to provide resources. Now, that may include even manpower. Now, there is an immediate correlation here to what China has been doing in South China Sea in creating these maritime militias, where 200, 250, fishermen go and surround a particular feature and occupy it virtually, saying that they are fundamentally rescuing themselves from storms, but occupying a feature which they want to claim and assert China's control over them. And that kind of gray operations and gray zones in case of Indian border have come to light lately. And I think that is where this increasing connect of what they call creating Xiaokhan, which means either the model village or the well-off village, which will have infrastructure, food support, all kinds of other support, including manpower, to work with the both PAP, People's Armed Police, and People's Liberation Army in those frontier areas, so that they can easily sustain their forward presence. And we have seen in last 2 years now how challenging it becomes to have this forward deployment continuously. And if you are basically looking at this kind of each side trying to stress and fatigue the other side, then sustaining forward deployment is going to be something which is going to be a great asset of both sides.
Right.
And this kind of exercise of connecting development, infrastructure building to defending and managing borders with support of local villages. And I'm even reading people talking about 1,000 villages, not just the 624 as it is being claimed.
Right.
And that connect, I think, is going to give them enormous staying power, and India must reckon that. And
Right.
in that kind of infrastructure war, which is going on both sides, India has to really put on much money and attention in building Indian side of infrastructure,
Absolutely.
connecting Indian population centers as well to what is happening on the frontier.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting coinage, infrastructure war going on. The point which Ninong Edingji and Mutsumi ji particularly has made, building of infrastructure. Professor Kundopalli, do you get a sense somehow, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of people think that this is in preparation or perhaps an more aggressive posturing or even an adventures in the days to come. Do you see it that way? Do you think the Chinese is building the base for perhaps a more aggressive posturing in the days ahead to settle the border issue?
A few things here. One, the land border law was proposed by the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National People's Congress, which is the parliament. And the deputy chairman of this is General Chao Chung-chi, who was involved in the Doklam crisis. He was involved in the Galwan crisis. And he stated that in the 70s and 80s, he went on foot in the LAC areas. So he is now the deputy chairman of this Foreign Affairs Committee, which passed this law. So you can imagine the thrust area in the line of actual control regions. Of course, this is the Chinese claim 22,000 kilometers of border with other countries as well. But the focus is obviously on India with the Chao Chumchis, who spent all his time in the Chengdu military region, which is now changed to Western Theater Command. So there is that focus on India. Second, obviously, is we have not completed the Galwan related synchronized disengagement process. There is also the problem related to the Chinese resistance to vacate Depsang plains. And now with these well-off society villages, the focus is clear. On August 29th last year, the 7th Tibet Forum meeting, which Xi Jinping headed, mentioned about Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism. Secondly, in the 14th five-year plan, they allocated $24 billion, including on the roads, railways, and river projects that you mentioned. $24 billion. That is the amount that they plan to spend on these projects in the next 5-year plan, so next 4 years.
Yeah.
There is also the trust that they are putting in the border defense management.
That explains the trust the Chinese are putting, and that too, if I may use the words, Sao Chung is seen as a hawk as far as dealing with issues on the border with India, and the person who is responsible for the build-up, for the escalation in the Galwan Heights as well as elsewhere in recent times is the person who is the deputy chairman of this Foreign Affairs Committee of the National People's Congress. So that is very, very significant point which Professor Kondapalli has made. Mr. Ninong Ering, once again to you. Now, do you think what Mr. Mutsu Mithi has said, that the Arunachal people in Arunachal Pradesh have become immune to these threats? What do you make of it? Do you think the people in Arunachal Pradesh have become immune because you have seen 1962, you have seen 86, you are familiar with the staple visa issue? The Chinese consider Arunachal Pradesh as part of their land, which is something extremely logical, etc. But if you become immune, that means, do you not respond?
My younger brother, Muchumiti, naturally he will feel like that, and I think I can understand the sentiments and the others also. But we have always pleaded, myself, Mr. Tapirgao himself, Kiran Rijiju, or even before them, all the MPs have always pleaded about the staple visa. And let it be the NDA, let it be UPA, there has been no response as such, or there is nothing authentic. Now, when you go to these clauses of this law, they are saying the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, shall carry out border duties, including organizing drills and resolutely prevent, stop and combat invasion, encroachment, provocation, and other acts.
Right.
See, China has always gone for oppression, aggression, and they're suspicious. They have always been suspicious. That is why they have even made the Great Wall of China. So, to be very frank, the very lukewarm statement, the state shall, following the principle of equality, mutual trust, and friendly consultation, handle and border-related affairs with neighboring countries, it is just a namesake. It will never be there. Because when they say that Arunachal is part of South Tibet, so how are we going to have talks? You know the Panchsheel agreement. There, at least the China should agree to that. They have never agreed to that. And once again, I will tell you, when you speak about the disputed territories with both India and Bhutan, the passing of the law coincides with stepped up Chinese activity along the land borders, but also mirrored action in disputed waters in East and South China Sea.
Yes, that's the point.
Yeah,
That is the
that's the
point
point.
which
And then,
that is the point
and
which the
yes,
professors have been
and
making. Yes.
and it could create further, hurdles for us, because the 17 months standoff is already there. Now you see how their
Right.
construction of the frontline villages, or their the super fast trains to Ningchi. So all these factors say that they were building up the infrastructure along the border.
Right.
So
Now, Mr. Mutsumithi, Ninong Ering ji has said that, that it's our professors have said that it's an infrastructure war. And Professor Swaran Singh said, for example, that, India must focus its attention on the LAC and pump in more funds to catch up with the infrastructure. You also read this point that infrastructure on the other side is good. But now the point is, are you worried about these frontline villages? Do you see it as a preparation for something to come in the days ahead?
Well, the factuals, what is the policy? We are not aware of it. We are not a foreign policy expert. But I'll give you an udharan deta hu ki, the district just connecting to mine. It's the Chinese border district territory. So the PLA troops, they keep on coming patrolling into the LAC, into our territory, and they leave telltale signs. Writing some things in the rocks, or littering it with some Chinese products and things like that. So it looks like intentional posterity and things like that.
Right.
And so what we look at it from our point of view, from my personal point of view, is that they are preparing the logistics and the preparedness. That's what seems obvious to us. So in any time of military or in any type of this thing, logistics are very important.
Right.
So
Mr. Mutsumithi thinks that they are preparing the logistics. But for the sake of my viewers, Mr. Mutsumithi, where are you joining from? Which is the district headquarters? Where are you located at this point in time? You said you are very close to the Chinese border, that is the LAC.
No, my right now I'm presently in my home district, the Lower Divang Valley. It's a district headquarters called Roing. But bordering next to me is the next district, that is Divang Valley, that is bordering the Chinese border. I also have a border block in my constituency
Right,
also.
right.
I would like to reflect something here quickly.
Yeah.
What we have seen is that in the last, maybe due to the pandemic or whatever reason, we have seen that the border development area funds has been curtailed. The funds given to the
that is a
state
very important
governments.
point. Border developments fund has been curtailed. That's a serious point being made by Mr. Mithi. But before I go for a quick break, what is significant, Professor Swaran Singh and Professor Kondapalli, is the fact that Mr. Mithi, the president of the NPP party in Arunachal Pradesh, is joining me from a place not far from the line of actual control, and he has good internet connectivity. At least something is happening. We are connected with him from a very remote area. On that positive note, I go for a very, very short break. Don't go away. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Let me go straight to you, Professor Srikant Kondapalli. Professor Kondapalli, what should be India's response? Most people would like to know that. What should be India's response in this kind of a situation where this land border law is generally seen by many in the border areas particularly, including the opinion makers, including community leaders, they see this as some kind of a preparation by the Chinese to push ahead further to increase their aggressiveness along the border, some kind of an attempt to resolve the border dispute in a far more aggressive manner than what we have been seeing in the last couple of decades.
Well, actually, the Indian government had already taken a decision last year after the Galwan incident when 20 Indian soldiers were killed. We adopted a whole of the government approach now, if not a whole of the country approach as of now, which means basically we have the finance ministry, the commerce ministry, the IT ministry, the defense ministry, home ministry, all parts of the government have acted in unison. And as Dr. Jaishankar mentioned, unless until peace and tranquility prevails on the border, we're not going to open up for China in any field.
Right.
And in the background of that, the 218 apps have been banned. The infrastructure investment has also been stopped. Confucius institutes have been also closed. So there is an approach that was taken last year, which still continues. So it's a whole of government approach, number one. Number two, as a part of this, we are now constructing the strategic roads. 44 strategic roads have already been constructed last October, and more are coming up in different areas, including in Arunachal Pradesh. So there is the focus on infrastructure. In these infrastructure projects, probably we'll also have to add the chambers of commerce so that these become more sustainable rather than only for China-specific threat. The third that Indian government has already done is, of course, the joining of the Quad and various other multilateral institutions. Then, in terms of the military preparation as well, we have seen the 90,000 troops have been deployed, in addition to 50,000 for the strike corps. Then you have also the Indian Air Force highly mobilized. So the fact that the Chinese were not able to cross the line of actual control, nor their threats worked, it indicates that we stood up so far.
Absolutely.
And the costs for China have also been increased because the casualties on the Chinese side are said to be about 68, including one of their Western Theater Command commanders who passed away. They said he passed away because of cancer. But the terrain is such that the Han Chinese may not be able to really stay there in those areas with oxygen and other related issues. So on our side, we have not even seen one casualty during all this preparation. This suggests that our military approach has also been very stiff.
Absolutely.
And effective so far.
Absolutely. Yes, true. To take this forward, Professor Swaran Singh, in the last couple of weeks, we have seen a lot of, muscle flexing on the Indian side because there were a group of journalists who were touring the Tawang and other sectors in Arunachal Pradesh right along the LSC where, we have television footage of the Indian troops demonstrating their artillery, demonstrating and giving briefings to the journalists. It was a conducted tour, of course, in the forward areas. You cannot just land up and start reporting unless it is being coordinated by the Indian Army. So that is what has happened. There was a lot of coverage. And as we already know that, in 2021 and decades prior to that, Indian military has, increased their strength leaps and bounds. And we have tunnels coming right up to Tawang, through the mountains, through the high Himalayas. So this has also been in the public domain. The authorities have made no secret of these kind of activities, these kind of infra developments along the border. So, do you think that India also wants to send out a very, very clear message to the Chinese as Professor Kondapalli was giving those details about the Indian actions, Indian response?
Basweer, you have really touched the nerve of what is important to understand. I'm saying both China and India do not wish to start a hot war. They basically want to tire each other out by constant posturing and deployment in forward areas. Now, that requires two things. It requires physical infrastructure, which we have been speaking of, but it also requires social infrastructure, support of people in frontier areas to what is happening in terms of management of border by military. Now, as you just mentioned, not just our journalists, but our senior leaders, including Defense Minister, even Prime Minister, they visit these frontier areas
Yes.
and publicize their visits. All of these frontier areas, you are hearing, Mr. Meeti, Mr. Ninan Erong, they are so active and visible in these debates. And they are also equally active in national parliament. So all these people have in frontier areas sense of having a direct access to national decision making. Now China has that challenge of having these minorities in this frontier area, whether it is Yunnan or Sichuan or Tibet, and they therefore for a decade are talking of ethnic assimilation. That is their focus. As Srikant just mentioned, Han Chinese are not acclimatized to stay for long in these frontier areas. And if they have to recruit people from minorities, if they have to take support of minorities, they need to really, in that sense, placate them so that they feel assimilated and, happy to work for the national cause as Beijing would like them to do. So I think Beijing may have a certain edge in terms of material infrastructure, but India definitely has a clear edge when it comes to social infrastructure, which supports India's border management in frontier areas. And of course, look at the fact that it is United States Department of Defense report last week, which talks about military and security development involving People's Republic of China, that talks about 100 house village being created south of line of actual control. So United States is conscious of what China is doing in frontier areas. Why is that? Because the whole world, most of the major powers around the world today see China as their challenge as well. And therefore, India's challenge stands in tandem with how all major powers look at China as a challenge to each of them.
Absolutely.
Whether it is in terms of infrastructure building at global level, or creating new norms where issues of human rights, democracy are ignored when Chinese go out and invest in other countries. But India's concerns with regard to China, they conform to concerns of all major powers today. And therefore, not only India stands to gain in terms of its social infrastructure on the frontier areas, but also in terms of its political engagement at the global level, where India sees several countries standing by it.
Absolutely.
Simple example, look at the coordinates provided by satellites of United States to locate, movement of PLA across the frontier areas for India. Immediately all equipment, material, resources are made available, and India can import things from any of these countries at very short notice.
Correct.
Obviously, Chinese have access to only Russians. They don't have access to high altitude warfare fighting equipment from any other source.
Right.
So if you have to think of long-term deployment in tiring each other, then India's connect with the major powers, which has grown enormously lately, and India's connect on the ground in frontier areas with our own citizens,
Absolutely.
is our strength.
Two very important points made by Professor Swaran Singh. India's connect with the major powers, that means India's diplomacy and foreign policy is paying dividends now, and it's connect with the people. That brings me to Mr. Ninong Ering. Ninong Ering ji, all these years China has been saying that okay, Arunachal Pradesh is South Tibet, Arunachal Pradesh is South Tibet, but they have failed to elicit any response from the people of Arunachal Pradesh, who are extremely patriotic, and the link language in Arunachal Pradesh is Hindi. Many people in the rest of the Indian mainland may not be aware of this. The people speak in so many dialects, so many different ways they speak, so many tribes and sub-tribes, but the common language is Hindi. This is something India, the rest of India, that is the mainland Indians need to know. But do you think the Chinese are totally frustrated, Ninong Ering ji, that they have failed, despite the claim of Arunachal Pradesh as a part of southern Tibet, they have not failed, they have totally failed to give any kind of reaction, any kind of favorable reaction from anybody in Arunachal Pradesh?
To be very frank about this issue, my late father, late dying, Earing was a member of parliament in 1962, and he was also a union minister in 1966-67. And then again, I am also a second generation union minister. I was a union minister. So that itself proof. And now Mr. Kiran Rijiju is their law and justice minister. So here the Chinese demand that okay, it is South Tibet is completely people of Arunachal have just taken for granted. They don't even give any importance to it, like my Chota Bhai Muchumiti was saying. But when we are coming back to this law, we will say that China has got its own issues. I'm sure the premier, Mr. Xi Jinping, has some issues in his own country, and he just want to antagonize the people along the border with the 14 countries he wants, because India has a very long border of 3,400 kilometers. So just to antagonize that, he is trying to, show it to his people. In Hindi, I can just give you one this thing example for him. हर शाख पे उल्लू बैठा है अंजाम गुलिस्ता क्या होगा बर्बाद गुलिस्ता करने को बस एक ही उल्लू काफी है. Let
Wow.
us hope that he does. Let us
Yeah.
hope he does not become a ullu, and good sense prevails, and try to have very cordial relations with not only India but with the rest of the countries also.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
Ninong Adingji, extremely well said. Actually, I don't have much time. Mithi ji, I was asking this question. Or the Chinese have failed to get any kind of favorable response. Usually, क्या होता है? There is some group or some section of people somewhere, who gives some kind of a statement. Even if you have to read between the lines, you said, oh, थोड़ा सा favorable हो गया है. लेकिन अरुणाचल प्रदेश में ऐसा कोई नहीं है, कोई भी नहीं है, whether it is individual भी नहीं है, organizations भी नहीं है, जो उनका मतलब उनका जो philosophy है, उनका जो expectations है, उनका जो सपना है कि अरुणाचल प्रदेश साउदर्न तिब्बत है, उसको सपोर्ट करने वाला कोई भी नहीं, एक बंदा भी नहीं है, नॉट अ सिंगल इंडिविजुअल.
Well, sir, as the experts have said, Sorenji and Srikanji, the social infrastructure needs to be in place. The social infrastructure in the communities in Arunachal Pradesh are very patriotic, as you have mentioned it. We have nationalism in our veins. And so hence, even though the territory of China may be close to us, but within our hearts, it's millions of miles away from us. So, there is no cause of concerns in regarding to the support of the people. The social infrastructure is in place. What is required is the hard infrastructure. And so that is how we have to go about. Now, I do not, diplomacy and external affairs is beyond my pay grade, but the land border laws that significant news have come in. As a common man, what do we perceive out of that? What is the message that we get? That China anyway can do anything it wants, but a law
Right.
being enacted by them is just solidifying what giving you posturing you more with firmness and hardness that they can do whatever it is.
Absolutely.
So, but the people, there is no absolutely nothing in the ground, for any support of the people or for the Chinese
Absolutely.
people.
That is the point I was
mean,
making. That is the biggest dividend which we have in India.
Yes.
Final comments from you,
Obviously.
Professor Swaran Singh. How do you see the road ahead? Very briefly.
I think I fully agree, Basveer, with Mr. Mithi. We have an enormous advantage over China when it comes to our social infrastructure. And we therefore need to perhaps focus much more and be more innovative. And I was delighted when you mentioned that internet is so clear when Mr. Meety is speaking from closer to LAC. And that kind of innovative approach to connecting people with mainland, connecting people with the decision making, and also taking their views as to what kind of infrastructure can actually be useful on the border areas, which can be beneficial both for the border management, but also bring relief, welfare, prosperity to local people there. And that really, is interesting. One loves to hear people mentioning from these frontier regions how patriotic they are, how close they feel to mainland India compared to mainland China. But I think they also deserve much greater attention on creating these facilities on the ground for themselves. I'm sure lately we have seen enormous the focus being devoted to building infrastructure, material infrastructure in these frontier areas. In entire Northeast, we can notice enormous connectivity of major cities, capital cities happening. But when it comes to frontier areas, I think we need to really focus much more on those areas. And I think we are increasingly going to face this asserted
Absolutely.
Chinese claim of not allowing such attempts
Right.
by India to strengthen our frontier areas, and that will be the challenge for us.
Absolutely. A last word to you, Professor Srikant Kondapalli.
I think what China is doing in terms of the land border law is to consolidate the Communist Party state apparatus in the border areas through the well-off society and other infrastructure projects. Also, harmonization of these border areas, frontier areas. Expand the Belt and Road Initiative connectivity projects so that they also push the financial sector in this. And also expand the China's influence operations in the neighboring states, including in our neighborhood. So Nepal, Bhutan is a specific example
Right.
where we need to factor in. So I think that is where we need to also focus on in countering these any dangers that we may face.
Absolutely. The Chinese may be desperate to build infrastructure and increase their defense along the LAC. The Chinese may be pursuing actually a policy to hold on to the land it has been illegally occupying for decades now. But the silver lining is that the assurance we get from our political leaders, from the people in the frontier states, and from our army that the preparedness is always there, and we are ready to tackle the rivals, or ready to tackle any misadventure from across the border. And as Swaran Singh said, it's an infrastructure war, but India already has an edge as far as its social infrastructure is concerned. That is something which no one can deny. And thank all my panelists. It's a pleasure speaking to all of you gentlemen. Always pleasure speaking to Swaran Singh, Professor Kondapalli, Mr. Ninong Ering, and now of course Mr. Mutsu Miti. Thank you very much indeed for being on the show, and good night and goodbye, and thanks all the viewers for watching the program.